Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we talk to foresters about how they are using digital technologies in their day-to-day forestry work. All right, well, welcome to the Digital Foresters Podcast. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Max Nova, COO of NCX, formerly known as CilviaTerra. Max, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, it's good to see you again because I haven't seen you, I swear, in a couple of years. It might have been up in the Northeast. I still remember fondly. It might have been, we were at an event and we were actually at one point trading stories about health and tracking and these gadgets. And I always loved chatting with you because the best way I could describe it is like you're a hustler, you're a go-getter, technically savvy. Even when we were staying at places, I was like, where are you staying? You're like, oh, a couple miles that way. I'm like, why aren't you staying here? And it was like cost was always like at the forefront. We're lean, we're hustling and stuff. And I just love that about you. But today you're coming to us from where?
I'm down here in Austin, Texas these days, but still working hard.
Austin, Texas. Nice. A lot of, I believe, people who have fled other areas of the US, and Austin seems to be the place to be. So to kick things off, I always ask our speakers to describe how they got into forestry. So maybe introduce, whether there's a familial tie or if it was really school or what got you going into that space of forestry.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my father is a urologist, so I knew pretty early on that was not going to be my career path. But I went to undergrad thinking that I was going to be pre-med, and that I was pretty swiftly disillusioned from that path, along with half of my class there at school. But through my sort of wanderings through, well, what do I even do with my life now that I'm not gonna be pre-med anymore? I ended up doing a summer internship at the Yale School of Forestry, which is where I met Zach, who's my co-founder and is the CEO of NCX. And it was an awesome summer. And forests, I think, are just so fascinating. I was a really kind of math, computer science oriented guy. And it's not something that I think a lot of people on the outside really appreciate, is how sort of technical and quantitative forestry really is. And so to me, that was, I just fell in love with forestry, and I haven't looked back. And now we're 11 years in.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I often joke forestry is one of the most complex spaces of work, and people often think toilet paper, cardboard, Kleenex, the usual stuff, but they don't often realize it's a fuel source. It's in clothing. The clothing you may be wearing may have forest products there, but fascinating from that point of view. So you mentioned Zach. So Zach's obviously co-founder, CEO of NCX, as you said. So maybe tell me more about that relationship. I know as you guys were early on, young guys, as I think about some of the technology you guys were building, where did some of those ideas come from? Was it really, while at school, kind of hacking, hustling, the proverbial garage, we're in the garage doing our thing, but where did some of these ideas that would eventually form the basis of your technology and even NCX, and we'll go there, we'll try and go through that temporal journey, but where did that magic, I guess, come from? Was it really just personalities? You guys just jived, or was there some mentorship, people prodding you? Obviously your dad was probably disappointed that you were carrying the family trait in urology, but I'm sure he's probably equally proud and excited. Yeah, absolutely. But was there a spark that got you to kind of on that journey?
Yeah. Well, so our version of the garage was a dark basement lab at the it's this building called Greeley at the Yale School of Forestry, which isn't even in like the main building. It's like this sort of like satellite lab that they have way up the hill, and that's where Zach spent a lot of his time doing his master's at Yale. And really the core vision for SilviaTerra, what's now NCX, really came from Zach. I mean, Zach has this kind of really unique perspective on forestry where he's very quantitative, but he's also been out in operations, and he also understands the policy angle and the economics and all the ecology, all of these things that have to come together to be a truly great forester. You kind of have to see the whole picture. And to me, that's what's always been really fascinating about forests, is I think they are some of the most complex systems on the planet. And Zach just has this intuition for how to think about forestry and forest management, and putting things like carbon and wildlife habitat and all of these sort of what people think of as ecosystem services on the same economic footing as timber, which is really what the mission of our company is these days. And that was Zach's vision from the very beginning. But we had a long way to go. to get to where we are now. And so we started off really just with sort of satellite based remote sensing of forest inventory, because that's kind of step one. If you don't get the measurements
Right.
right, everything else is made up. So
Right.
step one was get the data in place.
Right. So did the two of you ever think in the early days that, that entrepreneurship route would be the path you guys were going, per se? Was that always kind of the grandiose plans? Because it sounds like a lot of times people say you got to have the hacker, you got to have the hustler, and you got to have the money man to get that trifecta going. So it sounds like, yeah, I know you're technical by default, and sounds like what you described by Zach, the visionary, thinking big picture, then obviously, money's money. But was that always the plan? At what point did you guys go, you know what, we're going to launch SilviaTerra, back then, again, formerly now known as NCX, but in the early SilviaTerra days, like was that what you guys thought, like, as young guys, like, yeah, we're gonna, incorporate and then like charge for, like, what was that spark that put you guys down that path?
Yeah, well, so this was Zach was trying to figure that out actually for himself. Was what do I do with my life? Do I just go on and get my PhD? Do I go the academic route? Do I go work in industry? And he had worked at Plum Creek, or what's now Weyerhaeuser, I guess, before he started at Yale. And he was he asked people that he worked with. He's like, hey, like, what journal should I be publishing this in? And they're like, man, we don't read these journals. Like, build us a tool. Like, give us something that we can actually use out here that is going to solve real world problems. And so it was, Zach was kind of coming around to that idea. I had been very entrepreneurial, even back, like I started my first company in high school. And so I kind of had the bug, that
Yeah.
company didn't go anywhere, but, I had this idea in college. I was like, maybe I'll find somebody that, I knew that I didn't know anything about anything. I was some random undergrad, and I found Zach, and he just had such a clarity of vision for what the future of forestry and forest economics could look like. And I said, we should really think about turning this into a business. And so we did. But I mean, Zach, he's a very interesting guy, because he's got this combination of the forest vision, but he's also very technical. Like, he actually wrote a lot of the early statistical side of things, and then I was kind of the plumbing side, building all the engineering stuff to scale it up. We could go way down the rabbit hole on some really really gnarly debugging situations that we had in the early days. But and then, like, now Zach actually doesn't spend hardly any time thinking about the technical component of what we do anymore. It's all like talking to the big landowners, talking to
Yeah.
policymakers, and it's much more of kind of a traditional business role. And it's yeah, I mean, that's one of the awesome things I think about doing a business, and especially starting really small, is you have to wear a lot of hats. And so Zach and I have
Absolutely.
certainly worn a lot of hats over the last decade.
Well, it's great to wear those multiple hats and know what it's like to be in those shoes as you kind of scale. So think of yourself. I remember, like, it's interesting. So that business you started in high school, what was it about? What, just more out of curiosity? Obviously, it didn't become the Facebooks of the world, but there's got to
No.
be a good story behind that startup.
Yeah, well, no, it was school administration software. So it was like checking out textbooks and stuff like that. We had just built it for our high school, and then there was a couple other high schools in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where I grew up, that were using it. But it didn't go anywhere. But it was a great learning experience. To build something from scratch, to actually have real users, getting feedback from people about, they're like, man, this thing totally sucks. Like, none of this works. Like, it's super slow and whatever. And having to fix that and get into that cycle of improving the product. And I mean, we maybe made like $5,000 or something in the whole life cycle of that company, but it was great exposure. And
Yeah.
we worked so hard on that thing back then, and having to pull the plug on it too. I mean, that was I actually did not pull the plug on that business until we really got going with NCX, and
Okay.
that was a tough call, actually, personally for me. It's something that you've poured so much of your soul into, and
Yeah.
knowing when you have to just focus has been one of the big learnings for us,
Yeah.
and
Well,
for me personally.
yeah, definitely. Sometimes stopping something or saying no to something is the hardest thing, and absolutely focus. But we'll talk more about that in a moment. But focus is key. Now, I also remember talking to you. You've got an international travel, you've gone different things. I don't know, was it Sweden, the connection? I'm
Yep.
not sure if that's still at play, but tell me about that, because often when I talk with people that are doing these amazing things in forestry technology, as you're kind of hinting on, diverse people with diverse interests that have early starts in some things. Typically they end up in failure. I don't say that in a bad way, as opposed to, fail fast, often hear about that, but broad experiences. But the other thing I'm noticing is a lot of these folks, that worldview they have is also shaped by their experiences in travel. And tell me more about that link with Sweden, maybe, if it's at play.
Yeah, sure. Well, and just to be totally sort of cards on the table here, Zach's far more of an international mystery man than I am. Zach's career in forestry has taken him all over the place, from Brazil to Armenia, and lots of places in between. I spend a lot of time in Sweden just because my wife is from Stockholm originally. So I usually, unfortunately, I end up spending the holidays in Sweden. I would much rather spend the summers in Sweden.
Yes.
The holiday season is a little dark and cold for my taste in Scandinavia,
Yeah.
but it's great to spend time with her family over there. My Swedish is still not so great, but most people in Sweden, their English is flawless. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember last time I was in Stockholm, I think it was spring, and it wasn't that, by Canadian definitions, that warm. And us Canadians, like, it's 10 degrees Celsius, we're in shorts already, type of thing. But all the Swedes were out and about on the patio.
Oh, yeah.
And until someone told me, it's like, it's dark so long, Kev. It's like, as soon as it's kind of nice, it's like we're all out. And they were all out, like, pretty much 18 hours of the day. So cool connection there, per se. So I'm going to move you forward in some of the discussions. So thinking about Plot Hound and CruiseBoost, walk me through the thinking of Plot Hound. It was a free piece of software, obviously, for timber cruising. As we talk about Zach, as we start getting more into the technical stuff, and I know you mentioned, like, both of you were pretty technical at the start, but maybe for our listeners, tell us what Plot Hound is, and how it ties with CruiseBoost, and what the general thesis was around what you were trying to do with that.
Yeah, sure. And this is going to be useful to talk about too, because I think it's going to illustrate the big pivot that we've made in our business. For the last 10 years, I would say we've really focused on kind of a precision forestry, for lack of a better term. Like, how do you get good measurements of what's actually going on in the woods at a resolution that's much finer than what you would typically do with a traditional timber cruise. And so CruiseBoost was kind of our core offering, where we would combine a small amount of field measurements with remotely sensed satellite imagery and use that to generate these high resolution forest maps. And so, part of that though is, how do you collect the field measurements to calibrate that? And early on in the company, my job was to get faxes of people's tally cards and manually input that data into Excel spreadsheets. And I was like, man,
surely there's a better way.
Yeah. I was like, there's got to be an app for this. And there just wasn't. This was back in 2010 or something. Yeah. So the iPhone, I think, only came out in like 2008 or something, and so it was very early on. That was actually back when I was still in school. I was class of 2012, I guess. And so, as part of my undergrad, basically, I built the first version of the Plot Hound app, which was just Android and eventually an iOS application for navigating out to field plots, collecting data, and then sending that back to a website that would then work everything up.
Yeah.
And so that was, for us, that was a really popular way for people to start engaging with us, because it was free. It solved a major problem that a lot of people have. I was certainly not the only one writing up tally cards by hand, and so it solved a big problem for a lot of people, and it's been a really nice, just a sort of a nice marketing thing for us to do for the community that's been really useful and saved a lot of people a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, there's still a lot of people out there still, dare I call it, old school, still not even into that digital world, even though it's been several years that have passed from that point of view. So looking at that, like those tools, like wide adoption, I think looking at your website, there's some statistics that are showing, lots of usage, lots of, like, hundreds of thousand cruises done, et cetera, multiple states and whatnot. With that comes, as a freemium kind of model type of thing, I suspect a lot of requests of, like, hey, can we have this? Can we have that?
Right.
Et cetera. And you guys were small back then. So how did you juggle, trying to keep moving the products forward? Obviously there's product market fit as we think about that, because you got adoption, people are using it, whatnot. To monetize, to go from that freemium to a paid is a separate discussion. But thinking of just the number of users, I'm assuming there was probably a a massive nonstop inflow of like, Max, can we do this? Max and Zach, can we do this? And how did you juggle that and try and keep that customer relationship whole and positive, just thinking limited resources, limited time. Everyone thinks the thing they want is the number one utmost priority. Are you going to pay for it? No, I have no money to pay for it, but it's the utmost priority, right? So how did you guys juggle those competing interests as you were even thinking about some of these other things you wanted to work on?
Yeah, well, we had to say no a lot, and really our whole philosophy with Plot Hound from the beginning was that we needed something that would work for us internally, but we also wanted something that worked for 80% of people. And so we wanted to be very streamlined because up until 6 months ago, we were a little 10-person company. That was 10 years in. And Plot Hound was just one of many things we did. And actually, our big moneymaker for most of our company's history was CruiseBoost and the remote sensing side of things. And so we really did Plot Hound just as a marketing thing, more or less. And so we
Yeah.
certainly made investment in that over the years and made it a little bit more flexible. But the core ethos of Plot Hound was always, we wanted somebody to be able to install the app, create an account on the website, and be on their way out in the woods in 5 minutes or less. That was always the philosophy behind everything, and so that forced us to really keep it simple and really limited the complexity of the features that we would add.
Right, right. And that's brilliant. By the sounds of it, not that user is either like another person or someone internally, by the sounds of it, because as you said,
Yep.
it's the same tool you're using. So hey, that's brilliant marketing piece, but also your internal process is driven by that. So very cool. So recognizing now that your NCX and whatnot, as you said, and we'll get to there, the change, I'm really excited to learn more about it. So where does that leave Plot Hound and CruiseBoost? I guess thinking of those customers and whatnot, is it really, hey, it's out there, it's a great product, it's free, so free is free. Are you sunsetting it? Is there a lifetime to it, or are you still using it internally? Or maybe tell our listeners, because some of them I know who are listening to this are probably either
Sure.
already know I've got messaging, but they're probably also wondering, is there something else we can get from Max? But what's the plan for Plot Hound and CruiseBoost?
Yeah, sure. So Plot Hound's my baby. I built the first version of Plot Hound, and Charlie on our team is the one that manages all the Plot Hound stuff these days. And like you said, I mean, it's out there, it works. We're not putting a ton of new development effort into Plot Hound. I mean, we're keeping up, and it's a pretty low maintenance burden on our end, and it'll keep running. And it's always fun to see some of our biggest influxes of users every year are students at forestry schools all
Oh
across
yeah,
the US. And so it's always
okay,
fun, and it's just it's a nice thing that we can do for the community. And so, and it's pretty low
very
cost for us to
cool.
keep it up. And so I'm will there still be a Plot Hound? Yeah. 50 years from now, I don't know, probably not. Like, people will probably like be sending robots around in the woods or something, but
Yeah,
for the meantime, it's something that's easy enough for us to keep out there. And so,
right.
yeah, that's and then the Cruise Boost side of things, really we found that uh most of the large landowners who are the primary customers of Cruise Boost in the first place are way more interested in talking about the carbon side of things than they are talking about the forest
That's
mapping.
true.
I mean, this is the difference between a cost center of a business and a profit center of a business. And this has been one of the big learnings for me, is it is a completely different conversation depending on which of these two sides of the business you're selling into. And so that's been really interesting for us.
Absolutely, absolutely. So maybe we'll look at accelerating, getting to that point where we can I can poke at you a bit more. So as we went through the journey, and you jump in I'm kind of putting pieces together as we go. But Microsoft came into the picture
Yep.
prior to NCX becoming what it is today. So maybe Microsoft's big engine, big organization. Obviously, they got Azure Cloud, many other cloud solution providers out there, but you guys chose Microsoft. You went into what I think is like not quite an accelerator in the truest sense, but a partnership where you're both working on things. But maybe tell our listeners how that came to be, what the program was about. I believe is it Microsoft AI for Earth, or I always
Yep.
get them backwards. But maybe tell our listeners what that program is, how you guys got into it, and what really you wanted to get out of that relationship in the end.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so Microsoft AI for Earth is this program that Microsoft runs. That's the brainchild of Lucas Japa, who's their chief environmental officer. And Microsoft was actually very, there's a couple companies that have this title now, but Microsoft is actually kind of surprisingly, like you think Microsoft is, I mean, Microsoft's been around for a long time, but they're actually really one of the leaders, I'd say, in the sort of how do we be really smart about sustainability, and and they're smart. Like Microsoft like knows that this is one of the major waves that's coming here in the early 21st century, and so they're working really hard to get out in front of that. In fact, Lucas is he's always talking about the planetary computer is his big idea,
Okay.
for Microsoft. And so that for them, AI for Earth is was kind of how they began starting to wrap their mind around, well, what's going on in the world of sustainability and the environment and computation. And so they would give out these grants to to academics, to NGOs, to small companies, startups, um, that had interesting things that they were doing with either remote sensing data or any kind of data about the natural world that they could then use Azure credits to process or whatever. And so we were actually one of the earliest AI for Earth grantees, and we saw this and we said, man, we're running CruiseBoost on kind of this project by project basis for all of our clients across the United States. And we sure would love to have a map of the entire US. This has been a sparkle in Zach's eye since the very beginning.
Yeah,
Is can we
yeah.
go coast to coast mapping of the full country? But it was, it was always a non-starter for us because it was going to be prohibitively expensive. And then we saw this AI for Earth program and we said, hey, Lucas, we heard you got unlimited compute over there at Microsoft. And he's like, that is basically true. And we're like, well, something really cool we could do if you gave us just an enormous amount of compute credits. And so that was the origin of Basemap, which we were really proud of. That was the first ever high resolution forest map of the whole continental or contiguous United States. I always get them mixed up. The lower 48, you know what I'm
You
talking about.
got it. You
But
got it.
anyway, so yeah, that was an enormous effort to actually get that to work. And I actually was still kind of in the weeds working on that to get the very first version of that through. Now we've got it down to a really streamlined process where we run this every year and like maybe even every quarter moving forward. But that was a huge push for us, and Microsoft was hugely supportive of our first uh, kind of our very first iteration of that base map to make it possible.
Yeah, so I know on the website, base maps is described as, and yeah, I can only imagine, building that pipeline, probably how much pain there was at the start
So much pain.
versus now, where it's like looking back, what was it? Maybe it should have been that easier per se. But thinking of base map, I think looking at your website, it's ingesting Landsat, NAIP, SRTM, different types of remotely
Yep.
sensed data, marrying it with boots on the ground data to create base map, which is totally cool. Because as I think about, and we've seen it in other marketplaces or data ecosystems where you have a lot of content providers
Yep.
producing things and then using data and reselling it, data as new oil. But this is the first forest centric large area mapping that, to your point that you just said, is repeatable. You're generating on a certain cadence. Like, this is a game changer, no, in terms of having this data available and using it, whether for your marketplace or other use cases. What's been the feedback from at that stage when you guys produced that out of the Microsoft program and that grant model? What was the feedback? Because I'm curious to know, like, you and I have been at this for a while. The world has changed. Whereas, back when we used to be on the grounds hustling type of thing, we'd be talking about web services and the foresters would be like, what? It's like, what are you guys talking about? And then now it's like, hey, Max, what's the rest endpoint I could hit? Is it secured? Or, like the vocabulary has changed. But I'm going to assume that it wasn't like right away, everybody, like all the landowners, foresters, were like, oh, it's like, yeah, I love this, I'm going to take it. Was there any skepticism or any doubt? Accuracy always pops to mind, etc. Share with me what some of those early days were like in terms of base map when it came out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so we pretty immediately had a lot of inbound interest around people saying, hey, I want to get my hands on this data. I want to understand, I've got some use case that I want to apply it to. Uh, One of the interesting things though is that a lot of people just they were like, well, what would I do differently with this data?
Okay.
Where's the actual value here? And that's one of the really powerful things about NCX is, no one cares about the data per se. Yeah, the data is just bits on a hard drive in the sky somewhere. The real question is, how is that data going to change the way you value and manage the forest? And so we'll talk more about that later. But when it comes to the accuracy of all this stuff, this is a constant question. And this is what we spent the first 10 years of our business doing, fighting a ground war, just like state by state, region by region, forest type by forest type, saying, well, hey, like, what's the performance? How do we check this against ground data? And it's base map is not perfect. I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where we have a perfect mapping of every twig on every tree. And the question is, well, what's the point of doing that, right? The data is just the data. The real question is, what decisions do we want to make about the forest, and what is the appropriate resolution? What is the appropriate precision of the data to be making those decisions? So
yeah, it's a great point, and it's kind of funny when we think back to some of our earlier days. uh, I'm seeing, I'm curious to see if you would agree that when people are learning, they tend to gravitate to, I don't want to call them the obvious questions, but maybe the usual ones around accuracy and like how big's the data, how do I move it and stuff. And times have changed, and I love hearing like you messaging around. And I'm going to paraphrase, there's a problem, whether it's a business problem or whatnot. Like, what do we need technology wise, whether it's one type of data or not, to address that problem versus getting caught in the weeds? Is it a 10-meter pixel? Is it a 30-meter pixel? Is it, what is it? And what if there's a new, the wood sat that's gone up in space? How is that going to affect things? And so it's great to hear that. But one thing I think I'd be curious also to poke your brain on is uh, LiDAR has been, still is, the hot button topic. Depending who you talk to, it's almost like it just came about yesterday, even though you and I both know it's been around for decades. And really, when you dig back into literature, it goes back to the 60s and some of the early technology. But how are you navigating that as we think about base map? Because obviously, to do it at that scale, you got to be spaceborne, leveraging all those different sources. And I think from your website, if you have LiDAR, great. You have hyperspectral. It's almost like if you have these other nice to haves and fantastics, it's probably going to make a better, improved product. But how are you stick handling that as you're running across and saying, we've got this thing? It's like, I'm assuming it's still the hot thing. Yeah, but Max, it's like, what about LiDAR and like single photon, Geiger mode, right? And like ICESat-2 and JEDI and all that stuff per se. How are you seeing that on the ground, or really now the focus is on players that really aren't asking that question, those types of questions, and are really focused on the business side of things?
yeah, well, I think actually what you just finished with is becoming increasingly true. It's overwhelming, the number of options that people have. And the reality is, like, people don't care if you got like magic elves running around, like, as long as it's as long as you can demonstrate that, yeah, like this has certain performance characteristics, and critically that you can quantify that and then tie that to the business decisions. I mean, this is one of the things I actually think is really missing in the practice of modern forestry. It's great to have all this data, but the question that almost no one can answer is, what is the appropriate level of precision to get in your estimates based on the financial decisions that you're trying to make? And it's tough because it's not enough to know what the precision is on your inventory for certain products. That needs to get run through your growth model, through your
Mm-hmm.
harvest scheduler, through your price estimates of all this stuff. And there's this compounding levels of uncertainty. And I think a lot of people don't really appreciate that. And so they end up with some number that, like, at each stage of that process right now, the imprecision gets truncated.
Yeah.
And so you just have like a point estimate, and then, and so you get some out of your harvest scheduler, some, plus minus, confidence interval comes out, and you're like, oh, okay, that's what my, this is the range of values I should expect. And it's like, no, like what you should have done was like this ever expanding, compounding
Right.
uncertainty. And this can really, really womp you to the tune of like tens of millions of dollars, depending on the transactions that you're thinking about. And the technology and the systems just aren't there right now to propagate that uncertainty through the whole decision chain, which is really
Right.
tough. And
Yeah.
so you know, it's tough, I think, generally to make a economic case for something, for increasing precision generally, without an understanding of like, okay, well, how does that translate all the way through the value chain? Because if you don't do that, then it's just like, yeah, like the pictures are beautiful.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, that's true, but it's a question of like, well, is it worth it? And
Yeah.
and that is actually a tough economic technical question to answer, and
Yeah.
one that I don't think many people are set up to answer right
Well,
now.
absolutely. And we've bumped into people where they're, picking at things or nitpicking at things, and they don't really have a foot to stand on reality. They don't even have, in many cases, any form of, I'll call it real data, or they've been using things they've always done in the past and have just assumed like it's good enough. It's not, if it's not broken, then why would I look at this? And meanwhile, I think that's missing the point of the opportunity that, yeah, it may not be broken, but the whole world's shifting. It's like, wouldn't you want to be more efficient? Wouldn't you want to be more cost effective? Wouldn't you want to be more sustainable, or and all those different things? So I'm sensing there's a change, and I'll be curious to near the end of this pod kind of get your thoughts on seeing why you think that is. But I think this is a great segue to say, okay, so we're at the point now where, you've got base map, CilviaTerra, you said you're around 10 head count, and now you're the CEO. Zach's the CEO of NCX. I always say FKA, formerly known as CilviaTerra per se. There's all this jargon. I'm sure you discover, right? OG. I remember when I first heard of it, I had to look it up. Like, what was an OG and stuff like that. But anyhow, but you're in that world now, right? Like, you are venture backed. Tell me about how you got there, who your backers are. Was this a walk in the park? You just kind of rolled up, on maybe, I don't know, your mountain bike or whatever it is, your Tesla, and boom, you walked in and they said, yeah, Zach, Max, love you guys. Boom, here we go. It's smooth sailing. I suspect there was still a bit of hustle that was required, but tell me what got you guys to that point to say, you know what, we want to raise, and these are the folks we want to talk to. Me doing my research on your backers, I'm sensing they're specific investors you're looking for that shared a common vision on what the world could be. But walk me through that journey. I'm really curious now, because it's like, this is stuff like I don't know, we haven't talked about before. So tell me about that journey.
Yeah, totally. And actually, just to clarify, so Zach is actually the CEO. I'm the COO
Right.
over here. Zach's the face. He's the big ideas guy. Like I'm just the one back here at home base trying to make the sausage. But the funding thing for us, it really was driven by the sudden surge in willingness to pay for carbon. Like we do not have a business transacting carbon if no one is interested in buying carbon. And it seems like so long ago because it was in the before times, but it was really just January 2020, I think, that Microsoft announced that they were going to be carbon
Right.
negative or carbon, whatever it was. And that really set off this parade of all these other corporations making these net zero pledges that actually continued through the pandemic. And so it really, because I think a lot of these things had been in the work for a while. And so suddenly now there's this enormous willingness to pay for these things. And now it's a race, and the question is like, who is going to provide these carbon credits to, the Fortune 500 and all these other companies that are trying to make good on these net zero pledges.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were like, oh man, great, we're off to the races. So Microsoft makes this announcement in January. Like, we're working very closely with Microsoft. We're like, this is a great time to raise funding. And so we hit the road in February 2020, started having a lot of great conversations, and then the world fell off a cliff.
Yep.
And it was really tough. I mean, like, we continued trying to raise money throughout the early stages of the pandemic, and it was just like complete strikeout. Nobody, we got a lot of meetings and got zero yeses for months and months and months. And it wasn't actually until I think it must have been like September when we met with Version One, which is a San Francisco VC firm, and then Union Square Ventures, which is a New York VC firm that often co-invest together on deals. And they both immediately got it. I mean, they're both kind of marketplace style investors. They invest in lots of different marketplaces. And so they immediately got what we were trying to do, connecting the Fortune 500 with all these landowners and sort of making that a easy, transparent, fluid, liquid process. And yeah, and it was kind of a whirlwind thing. We had a meeting. I think I had a meeting Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday with the Version One guys, and then they were ready to sign a term sheet.
Wow.
And and so it changed just so fast. And and then what's been crazy is that was our seed round, which closed around Thanksgiving last year, and then we just raised our Series A in April. So, like less than 6 months or something later, just because the markets right now are so hot for
Yeah.
funding stuff, and there's so much demand for
A lot of dry powder on the side there
yeah,
waiting.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And the Federal Reserve money cannon is just like running full bore over there. So there's a lot of money out there. And so we said, I know we just raised our seed round, but it feels like the money is cheap and we have a lot of work to do and we know exactly how we're going to spend this money. And so actually since our seed round, we've gone from 10 people to 30 and we'll probably double
Wow.
again. So
Wow.
I mean, it's kind of a crazy year for us, but it's been a hell of a ride. And so our Series A, which we just closed back in April, so that was led by Mark Benioff, who's the Salesforce CEO,
Yep.
and joined by the Microsoft Climate Innovation Fund, and then other people from our seed round. And that's just been a fascinating life experience. Zach and I went and met with Mark, and I've never met anybody like him. And the reason we got connected to Mark in the first place was, he had stood up at Davos a year or two ago, and it was like a trillion trees, and he
Yep.
was really sort of beating the drum on that. And so he was kind of like in our sights there for, because we're like, oh, here's somebody with, that's talking a lot about trees that, seems like directionally correct. Like, we're not like totally aligned. So like, we gotta, you know, get him on the NCX playbook over
Yeah.
here. But yeah, through some of our seed round investors, we got connected to him, and he immediately got what we were trying to do, and
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
was
Well, it's fascinating because once you start meeting some of those, those CEOs of these large companies, like in some respects, I always say, like at the end of the day, people are human beings. So even though they're CEO of Salesforce or CEO of Microsoft, they're still human beings at the end of the day. And in some respects, it's like, I can only imagine how cool it was, and probably a bit scary, maybe like, oh, we're about to go meet Mark or something like that. Like what do we do and stuff like that. But thinking of your seed series, like, did you guys have like a warm intro into some of those investors? Because often we hear, I've sat on different things where it's like, they're actually pitching startup founders and whatnot, and then often you'll hear it's like, no, don't cold call me like that. There's too many of you. But out of curiosity, because again, forestry technology, forestry
right.
like it's not like semi-autonomous vehicles right now where it's like it's cool. Don't get me wrong, because we're in the space as well. But did you have like somebody kind of nudging you, like that, maybe that mentor card, or was there a kind of a warm intro that kind of got you going, or was it really, again, you guys hustling, you guys have done it well. I've always admired you guys for that, but you guys are just hustling, just hitting the ground, calling. And I didn't realize it was Feb 2020. Like, oh my God, like
The worst.
the
Yeah.
worst the worst time, like everyone's freaking out, and you guys are trying to do this, so hats off to you guys. But did you guys have like a warm intro to kind of pull you on that journey, or it was just pure hustle?
Well, we ran through our warm intros in the first like 2 months. That was like 6 months in the desert, and it was a lot of just like being really tenacious, and the I mean, there's some element of timing. It's like by Thanksgiving, people were starting to feel better. There's starting to be some vaccine rollout, and some macro things were going a little bit better.
Yeah.
I think we were correct that there was this big upswing in interest for sustainability focused things generally. And yeah, it was just unfortunate that the pandemic really disrupted a lot of, and it's like, we were lucky, like our business actually did not get super disrupted. We were all remote from the beginning. A lot of people lost their jobs, and it's like overall, actually, we made it through the pandemic pretty well. So we were very lucky there, but it certainly made that fundraising very, very difficult.
Yeah. Well, today I guess it's kind of the norm, I guess, to do it virtual. Like the
Yep.
people I talk to, it's kind of stabilized, steady state. Assume it's virtual, although things are opening up. Yeah, fascinating story there. And so with NCX, so we've pivoted. So let's get to that pivoting side of things. Like clearly, and again, I'm going to say this, and you correct me if wrong. Plot Hound's important. CruiseBoost is important, but really the narrative shifting more to carbon, focusing on that, a marketplace where there's landowners, and walk us through the thinking now, the new business model, because I suspect NCX is not a SaaS company for Plot Hound or CruiseBoost.
Right.
It's pivoted. But what's the premise there now, or what's the spiel you give to people in terms of what NCX is today, especially for our listeners, because they'll know SilviaTerra, they'll know you and Zach, right? And some of them I know I've talked to, they're like, yeah, it's like, what's going on there? I'm like, oh, they're VC back now. They're on a rocket ship. So it's like, and for a lot of foresters, they don't really, not being in that tech space, knows what that means. But for our listeners now, like what's this mean for NCX, and what's the direction?
Yeah, well, I mean, Zach's vision from the beginning was always, how do we change the way forests are valued and managed? It's like the 21st century now. Seems like we should be doing better than just valuing forests for timber. And so for us, carbon makes a lot of sense as a place to start. We call it NCX for the Natural Capital Exchange, and that was intentionally not the carbon exchange, because there's all sorts of
Okay.
values that forests provide. We don't want to be myopically focused on just carbon, but also wildlife for reducing fire risk or better water quality or quantity. There's all of these things we want more of or less of out in the woods, and we don't really have great levers as a society to pay to get more or less of these things. In fact, the only thing that you can really do is buy land and then manage it differently. But that doesn't really scale. I mean, land is pretty expensive as far as things go, and yeah. And so for us, the pivot to NCX was really driven by this idea that, like, yeah, data is great. It's important to have data. Measurements really matter, but the data is not what's valuable here. It's the underlying forest that's valuable, and being able to use that data to change the way the forest is valued and managed. That's where the big value unlock comes here. When you can go to landowners and say, hey, I know you got 1,000 acres of forest land and you've only been being paid for the timber on this land. Would you like
Right.
also to be paid for the carbon or for the red cockaded woodpecker habitat, or, for like whatever it is?
Yeah.
And there's just been no mechanism for that. Timber works because timber's easy in a sense. You cut down a tree, you roll it across the scale at a mill, and you get paid by the ton. And so it's easy for the buyers and sellers to quantify what's being transacted, and everybody feels like they're getting a fair shake. But for carbon, fire risk, wildlife habitat, all this stuff that happens out in the woods, we've never had a great way to measure and pay for value. And so the transaction volume in these markets is pathetic,
Yeah.
relative to the importance that they have for our society. And so really the whole thesis of what we're doing at NCX is, okay, well, with base map now, where we measure every acre every year, we've got the measurements right. And so now let's just put all these ecosystem service things, all these types of natural capital on the same economic footing as the timber. And so from a landowner's perspective, we want to make it as easy to sell your carbon as it is to sell your timber. And we do all
Right.
the measurement and monitoring to make that possible.
Right. Very, very cool. And when you talk about ecosystem services, I think back to my undergrad days where his name Richard Florida. He was doing a lot of work and trying to quantify what ecosystem services are worth in actual dollars to try and bridge and make that connection with society in terms of these things. You go in the backcountry, you're camping and stuff, but there's value there. And how do you put it on at a parity where people can relate to it and go, yeah, this is worth X to me. So that's totally cool. Love that. Thinking about that, like, is this unique? Like what NCX is doing? Are other? Is it kind of what is it? The saying, the blue ocean saying, or something like? Is this something a wide open? You guys are blazing the trails per se, or do you feel like you're always looking behind the because you're VC back now, so you're on the radar. There's probably always startups, kind of trying to do different things. So thinking about NCX and the positioning, where do you see the short term piece? Like obviously continental US, that was where continental US, right, versus the contiguous side, but I know what you mean. But what's the play like? Focus on the US is the grand plans. I'm going to assume, based on what you said, like scale this sucker out globally, the Americas, and start going elsewhere, then have a, dare I say, we're into that digital twinning of the earth, and we've got all, we can go geek completely on this call. Are we going into that, the web 3.0 with crypto and a metaverse and everything's digital and tokenizing things? Like that's something I'd be curious in terms of some of the stuff you guys were doing with NCX. It's like, well, if it's an asset, as you said, that's a construct of value. There's lots of assets right now. You've watched the NFTs, right? And going, could there be a world where these assets with the ecosystem service are tokenized and then people can, I don't know, that's pretty far out there. But to the original question, what's the short-term plan? What's the big vision that if you guys can achieve that? Because again, you're on the wave, right? You're Series A, so BC is coming. You're going 100 miles per hour, going fast, fast, fast. Put the seatbelt on. But where's the world looking like for you guys in the short term and the long term?
Yeah, sure. Well, and you'd asked originally, like, what does the landscape look like? Like, who else is out there? And I mean, we're building on the work of the early players in the forest carbon markets. I mean, people have been doing forest carbon projects for the last, 10, 15, however long it's been. And that was really pioneering work, and we're starting to see like some stuff come out now, some of these like Bloomberg articles and ProPublica articles about some of the shortcomings of those projects. And, really, I think our responsibility as foresters in the 21st century is to see, like, well, listen, those guys were making a start at this. That was the very first time people had tried to do that. And like, was it going to be perfect? No. Like, is what we do perfect? No. Like, but the objective should always be like, can we quantify how well we're performing, and can we constantly improve? And so that's, I really view what we're doing at NCX as an evolution of the sort of early work that people had done in forest carbon projects, whereas, it's kind of boutique. It was a little clunky. You had to sign up. You would go project by project. You have to sign a 100-year contract. The measurement and monitoring costs were like took 2 years and $200,000, so that only the really big landowners could do it. And we've kind of taken that model and said, the good thing here is that there are real transactions happening where you're paying people to grow older, more carbon-rich trees, which is ultimately what the game is all about. But when you have a data set like Basemap, where you're measuring every acre every year, it allows you to just totally reconceptualize how this works. And instead of doing a system where you pay all the money up front and then you pray that for the next 100 years the forest doesn't burn down or whatever, I kind of think of that as the pay and pray approach, which you can do. But if I was spending my own money, I'd want to do more of a payment for performance or a payment on delivery system, where every year you get paid for the actual value that you've delivered. And so you could never do that before, because the measurement and monitoring would have just been prohibitive. But now that we're measuring every acre every year with Basemap, we can really do a kind of new economic model for this. That's a lot more fluid. That's a lot more flexible. That works for landowners, because, for us with NCX now, we can show up to a landowner and we say, hey, do you want to participate in forest carbon projects? And they're like, well, I'm kind of interested, but I heard I'd have to sign a 100-year thing. And we say, no. It's a 1-year thing. Like, just don't cut down your trees this year, and then we'll talk again next year. And for us, it's this, one of the things that I think is most sort of intellectually beautiful about what we do is we treat the whole country basically as a forest carbon project. There's only one atmosphere. The reality is there's only one forest carbon project. It's called planet Earth.
That's right.
And so the question, though, is, okay, well, what do you want to have happen next year? Like, let's not think about 100 years from now. I think a lot of people get confused because they've got some idea of permanence, and it's like, there is no permanence in these complex real world systems. We gave up on steady state ecology in the 70s, right? So what do we want to have happen next year? Like, let's start thinking at the margin, because that's where all economics happens, is at the margin. What we want to have happen next year is we want people to grow slightly older, slightly more carbon rich trees. And so what's unique about NCX is it's this economic model that accomplishes that. Every year we're identifying what acres do we send dollars to create the most climate impact for the least cost at the margin.
Cool.
and really change people's behavior.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. Hey man, and I appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy. As we wind down, we got a couple last questions there in terms of, I'm just really curious. So, on my side, it's like, we're like a CilviaTerra bootstrap still, and going forward, I'm going to assume, like, you've kind of used the word wild ride the last little while. How has this experience changed Max Nova? Like, I'm assuming, like, young guy, you're going fast, etc. You're in Austin, Texas now, as we talk about, Zach doing different things. But, one thing I've always loved about you, just very humble guy, I'm just doing the back end. I'm like, yeah, but that's the magic. It's what makes all these things hums, right? And you can't do without it. But how's this experience going from CilviaTerra to NCX, being venture backed on the series ride there? How has that changed Max and his views on the world?
Yeah, well, I try not to feel anything anymore. I mean, we've been through so many ups and downs over the last 10 years of doing this business. I mean, this is where we thought we were going to be 2 years in. It took us like 11 years to get here. A lot of people are like, oh man, you guys are on a rocket ship. I'm like, man, this is like 11 years in at this point. It's been,
it's the slowest rocket ship ever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's just like I think it's a testament to Zach's vision, actually, at the origin of all this. I mean, Zach was a decade ahead of everybody back 10 years ago when we started. It's like he kind of saw all this back then. And so it's been really rewarding to actually help manifest this across the landscape. I mean, we did the single largest forest carbon project in the US by acreage on our first try, and we just had our summer cycle, which was even bigger. And so it's been
Yeah,
awesome just to like
bravo. Yeah.
watch that play out on the landscape. But we still have so much work to do. I mean, we're like at the very beginning of this whole thing still, I think. And so I'm just, we're all trying to keep our heads screwed on straight and just like do the work one foot in front of the other. I mean, it's pretty clear. It's like, you asked what's the plan? It's like, well, ultimately we want to be working with every landowner on every acre for every value, not just
Yep.
carbon, but wildlife and timber, and all these things. And like figuring out how do we get the landscape that society is willing to pay for? I mean, that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. But that's several lifetimes of work. So we're working hard.
Well, that's what you say. You just need a couple more rocket ships strapped on, maybe faster moving ones, and you're good to go. Yeah, definitely could share that. Forestry. Yeah, you're a guy I could explain this to. I know you're going to get it. I'd be curious to know your thought. Being venture back now, often there's these landscape pictures, right? You can look at big data, whatever, and there's these boxes that puts people in and whatnot. And as I watch the world unfold, precision agriculture, precision forestry, a lot of people are like, oh, these are like new terms. And you and I know they've been around for decades, and they just kind of go through this reincarnation, if you will. But one thing that's always irked me, and maybe this is a call to action to you and me and some other people, is that when we look at that landscape, there's ag tech. Okay, great, I get it. Ag's important. We're feeding people. There's quite broad. I never, ever see forestry tech or
Right.
for tech, like ever. And then whenever I talk about it, it's like, well, you guys are just agriculture. I'm like, excuse me? It's like, no, it's like, I don't think a forester would say that they're necessarily commercial agriculture as we know it today. But thinking of that, are you seeing patterns where there's a for tech or a Silva tech or a Sylvia tech or whatever it is coming? Because definitely you're seeing that space, like the VC space, going in the actual like space
Yeah.
space. It's a different community than the traditional EO players to some extent. Do you think we're going to see a forestry tech box forming that we can put our logos in there proudly? Sure. Well, what do you think on that? What are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think there already is starting to be sort of the rumblings of a climate tech ecosystem.
Okay.
is what people are calling it. But I mean, from just I'm a numbers guy, right? And the thing is, like, well, what's the annual value of the timber harvest in the U.S.? It's like about $10 billion. What's the annual value of the agricultural production of the U.S. every year? It's about $400 billion.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's why you hear a lot about precision agriculture. But I think if we're successful in our mission as a company and we help these landowners unlock the full value of their land, I think like actually forestry is going to start to be a major economic player, because the whole thesis of our company is that forests are systematically undervalued because we're only paying for the timber in these woods right now. And everybody knows that the woods are more valuable than just the timber. And
Yeah.
so it'll be an interesting decade to see
Yeah.
see where we start and where we end.
Absolutely. So second last question, what are the trends in technology you're seeing as the COO, building pipelines in Azure, dealing with big data, multiple space satellite systems going up there? Where do you see the trends for our digital foresters that are more like us, very tech savvy, already doing some of these things? They're not afraid of our data science. From your seat, what trends are you seeing in the geospace?
Yeah. Well, they don't let me write code anymore these days. Dr. Dan Pond, who's our chief data scientist, and Mike, who's our CTO, they're really the ones that are making the magic happen. I just I manage managers these days, which has been a personal, change for me. But when I look at the space, I think data science as a profession that's really what we do here. And whenever foresters are trying to figure out like, how do we take this data and use that to make better decisions? I mean, anybody listening to this, you like get your title changed to data scientist, and then they'll have to pay you a lot more money. But that's what it's about. And the tooling for that has gotten much, much better. I mean, in fact, my sister actually like runs machine learning platform at Databricks now,
Wow.
which is one of these San Francisco companies that's trying to make data scientist workflows more productive and more repeatable, and have version control for statistical models and like all these basic things that we really rolled our own for the
Yeah,
first 10 years of the company. It's like they worked, but it's so much easier to get started these days. And
absolutely.
so that's a big sort of meta shift that I think is going to accelerate progress and all this stuff. And there will always be new sensors. Like I kind of didn't really talk too much about the lidar thing. It's like lidar is great. Radar, SAR
Yeah,
satellites are great. Like, but all of this stuff I think is really just an input into this modeling process. And the question is, well, what precision improvement do you get in your estimates at the tail end of that thing? And that's what determines whether or not these things are worth it. And so that's something that we always keep an eye on, because like it makes a real difference for your economics.
yeah,
Um, yeah. So I mean, it's a exciting, and it's an exciting time, and things are getting easier and easier to do.
yeah.
Uh, and yeah, so that's
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Max, thanks so much for your time. I was so looking forward to chatting with you. It's been, I don't even know how many years, but definitely many years. So wanted to thank you and your team for agreeing to participate in this podcast. I think our listeners are going to love hearing the story here. There's like a lot of cool stuff. I'm going to be watching NCX and seeing where you guys are go. For our listeners who want to get a hold of you, how do they reach you? LinkedIn, website, email? What's the best way?
yeah. I'm just Max at ncx.com.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, my friend, thanks so much for joining. I'm wishing you all the best. Make sure to keep that seatbelt nice and tight
Snug.
and
Yeah.
snug, and looking forward to chatting with you in the future and seeing all the great things you guys are going to do. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks for having me, Kevin.